Hello friends, Romans, and country persons. I recently sent out a tweet, and as tweets will, this one found a life of its own out there in the Twitterverse. So I want to find my computer and read that tweet to you, and then I want to discuss it a little bit. Computer found. So the tweet says, if you do anything with enough focus, with enough care, the ego dies into that activity and a new self is born. This is Zen practice. So what I want to do today is just give a really brief overview of what my teacher called Tathagata Zen. It was his specific understanding of Buddhism. So I want to give a brief overview of that with relation to this tweet that I sent out. And then I want to bring out 3 comments and questions that people made on Twitter and by email and on Facebook to kind of unpack this tweet and my teacher's teaching a little bit. That's the plan. I never actually know what I'm going to do because these videos are always somewhat extemporaneous, like almost fully extemporaneous. I told myself a while ago, you have got to have fun. You cannot bring the heavy weight of perfectionism to these videos or you'll never do them week in and week out. So that's just a sidebar to say I appreciate people's support on here and also your understanding that I'm making it up as I go along. Okay, here we go. So Sasaki Roshi, my teacher, called his Zen Tathagata Zen. I'll put the word here. What I want to do is read a little bit from a Teisho, which was a public lecture that he gave on a koan from July 14, 1997. So it's a long time ago. So Buddhism addresses one thing, the problem of suffering. All of its metaphysics, all of its ethics, every single solitary monastic practice from Dogen's don't waste a grain of rice to the teachings about the Buddha looking up at the morning sky and seeing the star, all of this springs from this one seed. Let's end suffering, okay? So my teacher is kind of addressing that here, and he says the reason why troubles come up, the reason why problems come up is that we fixate our, in quotation marks, I am, end quotation marks, self. He goes on to say, as long as you're fixating yourself, as long as you're attaching to yourself, it doesn't matter how much you are able to satisfy your desires, you still will be stuck. So as long as your self is fixated, no matter how many desires you satisfy, you're going to be stuck. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. He can clearly satisfy his sexual desires with far more people than most of us can even fathom. And yet, I just read this morning that he had intercourse with the founder of Google's wife. My point is not to affair shame Elon Musk, but simply to point out there is no end to the project of trying to satisfy your desires, no matter how rich, famous, successful, and amazeballs you are. So the problem of suffering cannot be solved by meeting desires. It's solved by dissolving your attachment to the I am self. And Zen is a series of disciplines and teachings that aids us in this journey. It's a big rucksack full of upayas to help us do this. Okay, so now things get interesting in my teacher's Teisho. He says, the standpoint of somebody who is really practicing Zen, who really understands that there is no such thing as a fixated self, then for that person, no matter what you meet, no matter what you run into in this world, whether it's a flower, a man, a woman, a dog, a mountain, God, or the devil, no matter what you meet, Hitler or Mother Teresa, you know that the kind of practice you must do is to give yourself to this objective circumstance. So there it is. Give the self away. Give the self to whatever is in front of you. And then he says something wonderful. He says, giving yourself away is what we call making relationship. Give the self away, make relationship. I keep having to move. I'm in Prater Park and the sun is doing its thing, and every time I move along this log, it starts frying a new portion of my poor bald head. So moving on. So what exactly does Roshi mean by give the self away or make relationship with objective circumstance? He goes on to say that there is no true meaning to the word God outside of this manifestation of no self, or the complete self. And he says the complete self manifests when subject and object unite. You have subject and object, but for Roshi, they're better described as inside and outside. So I have my inside world. It's the world of my bloodstream. It's the world of my nervous system. And it's the world of the neurons and the serotonin levels and the synapses in my brain. All of this is part of my inner world, right? So in the Suzaki Roshi view, the view of Tathagata Zen, what happens is there's this inside world. And that inside world, which he calls the subject, is actually also objective, okay? It's objective world on the inside and an objective world on the outside, okay? So I just mentioned all those things that are the objective world on the inside, the neurons, my bloodstream, my serotonin levels, all that good stuff, right? And then I've got the objective world on the outside, which are the photons and the sound waves and the breezes that are tickling my skin. Now, what happens is these two worlds come together and they separate. They come together and they separate. They come together and they separate 80,000 times a second, or whatever your high unfathomable number is. They come together and they separate. This is making relationship. This is the objective circumstance making relationship. It's the activity of the Dharmakaya, or what Roshi, speaking to Westerners, called the God activity. But this is happening. Inside and outside are coming together, separating, coming together, separating. In between inside and outside, the self arises. So my mentor describes it as, imagine you've got black and you've got white. They come together and they interpenetrate and give rise to gray. So the self is like gray. It is the child born from the connection of inside and outside. But that child is continually dying and being reborn every second. It's almost like a hologram. It's almost like a mirage. It's almost like when you go like this to your fingers and then you see a third finger in between. It's a bit like that, right? Try it. You'll get what I'm talking about. So Roshi tells us that, as I read earlier, the kind of practice you must do is give yourself to the objective circumstance, or give yourself away, what we call making relationship. And what we call connecting to the objective or the objective world is to not fixate yourself. And by either doing the activity of expanding or the activity of contracting. So now Roshi has given us a recipe based on his philosophical system for giving, okay? There's a recipe for giving that he's given us. So he simplifies it and makes it really clear. There's two ways of giving. You can either initiate or receive. Those are the two ways of giving, right? So my teacher used to demonstrate this when we did koan practice with me. He would demonstrate it by a handshake. And a handshake is great because you have to both initiate by moving your hand forward and receive at the same time. And then there's a touch, right? And then you lose your sense of self in the activity of making relationship through the simplest thing on the planet, shaking a brother's hand. Or, for example, a conversation. You open your heart to your beloved completely without any filters or reservations. You tell them how much you love them, how much you hurt, what's bothering you, whatever the situation calls for in this hypothetical, very emotional moment, right? You give completely. And then you listen. You receive completely without a sense of self-righteousness or judgment or composition of your own rejoinder. This is giving and receiving completely. And the reason this practice of giving is so important is because it maps onto Roshi's Zen metaphysics. In his metaphysics, there is the dharma activity. And essentially, this is the activity of unity. Unity separates. And it separates into mutually opposing but complementary opposites. And he variously called these plus and minus, or male and female, or life and death, God and the devil, up, down, any mutually opposing but complementary opposite. Subject and object, for example, or inside and outside. This is how he sort of described the activity of life, of the cosmos. It's all, everything is essentially one. It's completely united, but then it separates. And the interesting thing to think about is, if everything was or is one, and then it separates, the point of separation is very special, because essentially you have a unity that is now separated. But because it was unified, if you are one part of the separation, then the other thing has exactly what you need, right? Like, that's the beautiful thing about the Dharma activity. Roshi used to call this teaching true love. I'm incomplete. I'm incomplete, man. I'm a born thing. I'm in space and time. I'm scared that people are listening to me and thinking I sound stupid. I'm worried that the sun is burning my head. I'm incomplete, but I'm also complete. I'm also part of the whole, and that which I am not completes me or fulfills me, if that makes any sense. If we define the whole ourselves as, let's say, right, then that which we lack will be left, right? So we completely unify with left, right? If that makes any sense. So this is why Roshi is so clear in his teachings over and over and over about not manifesting, not fixating on your preferences. And he says controversial, somewhat scary and confusing things like, you have to become one with God and the devil. Like, why would he say that? Well, the problem is we oftentimes state as bad the things that we think negate us. But in the end, the teaching is, we have to unify with everything. We can't manifest our prejudices because they get in the way of this activity of complete unification with our surroundings. So in order to groove up around inside of and dance on this teaching a little bit, I want to read a question that I got from a Twitter guy named Adrian L. He asked a question that everybody who is new to meditation and intermediate and probably advanced has at one time or another. He says, okay, remember the tweet was, if you do anything with enough focus, with enough care, the ego dies into that activity and a new self is born. So Adrian asks, who is it that applies the focus and the care? That's a very good question. He asks, is it the ego? He says, in meditation, I don't get the balance between conscious will and release/letting go. How can one do both at the same time? Such a good question. I feel that we already have an answer. It's just a different way of looking at this. If you're on the cushion and you're thinking, I don't know how to let go, I don't know how to force myself to let go, I don't know how to be relaxed. I don't know how to meditate. If you're having all these thoughts, you're not alone. People have these thoughts all the time. They're not sure if they're doing it right or how to do it. This is why I like Tathagata Zen and Rinzai Zen, because it's proactive. You give, this teaching of giving yourself to the exhale. It's like you're releasing all that inside world. All the self can do is direct the inside to the outside by exhaling completely. And I don't mean physically, although you can do that, but it's more like this sense of, like when you can give gently too. So it's somewhere in between very strong, forceful, very gentle giving. You release completely the exhale. And when that activity comes to its conclusion, now it's time for you to do the reverse activity, receiving or inhaling completely. And if you've done the exhale completely, then the inhale will happen naturally. This is what the Zen masters tell us. I offer that teaching to you. If you exhale completely, then the inhale comes naturally. Now, people always get stuck on the particulars. They're like, well, am I supposed to be thinking about pushing the breath out? And then I really tried to exhale really hard, but then I felt like I was getting asphyxiated. Just breathe, my brothers and sisters, just breathe. Let it out completely. Do the exhale completely, and then let the inhale come in completely. Don't get stuck on the details. In between conscious will, I must meditate, and letting go completely is this teaching of giving. It hits the sweet spot between will and total release. The second question came from Aparna Pallavi. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. They say, the focus and care cannot be forced, can they? You can't do what you don't want to do with focus and care? Question mark. That's a deep question. And, so I told her, well, most people don't want to clean toilets, but they can still do it with focus and care, right? Effort/giving doesn't necessarily mean forcing something. So then she really got into it. She said, yeah, that's certainly possible. She said, I didn't exactly mean necessary but unpleasant work like toilet cleaning. Listen to this. Ooh, this one, it gives me shivers. She says, I was thinking more on the lines of soul-crushing, compulsive work that happens in the process of earning a livelihood. Whew. So this is tricky. So a lot of times when I give this teaching of giving, it hooks on people. It sticks in their craw in a certain way, and I understand this because it's as though I'm saying, well, someone's being abusive towards you. Let's say a boss is being abusive towards you. You have to give yourself to that boss and receive his abuse. That is not what I'm saying. What you've done in that situation is the ego has turned itself into a victim in that situation, and that is not correct. So the ego isn't always aggressive. The ego isn't always conquering. The ego isn't always victimizing. Sometimes the ego is giving up. Sometimes the ego is being a victim and fixating oneself in the status of victimhood. So be careful. More along the lines of, let's say you get in a bad interaction with your boss, and you know that your job is, as this person says, soul crushing, right? What do you do in that circumstance? Well, I don't think that Zen necessarily is that career counseling, but let's say you leave your boss's office after a horrible interaction. This is something I've done time and time again when life really hits me with a billy club over the head and stuns me. You're always doing an activity, okay? You're walking down the hallway, put one foot in front of the other, give yourself to walking, give yourself to standing, give yourself to breathing. Get out of your head where the victimization is happening, where the trauma is happening, as much as you can. I'm not saying ignore it. I'm not saying put up with it. I'm not saying just forget about it, but I found it to be very helpful for me in moments of extreme emotional, psychological stress to remember my body. And when I calmly and meditatively do an activity like walking or just sitting and breathing in these moments of stress, the intense mentation diffuses throughout my body, and I find a moment of self-dissolution. This is helpful in bringing me to a state of equanimity and calm, what my teacher would call zero, so that maybe then a good idea or a good response to the situation can spontaneously arise. The third and final question came from a guy named Stephen, which is my Christian name. He says, "What about hunting animals? I stalk my prey. I get into a serious samadhi. I chase the animal across the forest, becoming one with the sounds and sights. I don't even know where or who I am anymore. Then finally, due to my intense focus and concentration, I am able to be one with the animal and corner it. I pull the trigger and murder it." Zen, he asks. This is a question I myself have asked 1,017,014,1602 times. I have a counter going. I've asked it a lot. I've asked it of people. I've asked it of my teacher. Nobody ever has a sufficient answer to this question, but it's a really important question. If giving the self away is what's important and you completely dissolve into an activity, then is the serial killer who dissolves into the activity of killing his prey manifesting Zen? I've heard stories about how the old samurai, inspired by their Rinzai Zen teachers, would test the sharpness of their swords by killing peasants, right? No good, no bad. Let's see how sharp my sword is. They would kill peasants. Don't know if this is true. Heard it. Now, is that Zen? I don't have an easy answer to this question. I mean, I remember when I was studying with the Shambhala group in Los Angeles, they had a root teacher named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and I was really connecting with these teachings. And then I discovered that this root teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who came from Tibet, had just committed massive amounts of misconduct. I mean, he was really quite a character. Sexual misconduct, probably financial misconduct. He had weird militaristic practices that he brought to his Sangha. I mean, a guy that, gave beautiful teachings on the one hand and seemed to be just a kind of a mess on the other hand. He actually died of drinking. He drank himself to death. And, you have to really ask yourself, like, how does this practice, how did these teachings of Buddhism, which offers such beautiful wisdom, how did these teachers wind up being such messes? That's the question that Stephen is asking here. And it's the question of ethics, and it's the question of right and wrong. And I'm going to leave you with that question. But I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask myself, to not get too distracted by it. My experience was that most people who came to the meditation cushion were not looking to find a way to do serial killer samadhi. Most people come with a deep question that stems from suffering, and they want relief to that suffering, and by now they know, and you probably know, that behaving in a more egoic, conquering, selfish way is going to cause suffering for themselves and suffering for others. The teachings are very, very clear, okay? My own teacher, Sasaki Roshi, said enlightenment, or Kensho, which is a great opening, means I look at the other and I see myself. So if you are harming the world around you, you are harming yourself. And the way this teaching and the way this truth arises in you, it's different for every person. And every person makes mistakes as they do their daily life and they try and manifest this truth. Even enlightened people can make mistakes, but the teaching is always clear. Remember, we're one unit, one dharma, one God, and then that splits into two, mutually opposing but complementary opposites, and then those two split into the 10,000 things that are our manifest world. But ultimately, all things are one thing. What I do to the world around me, I am doing to myself. So maybe at some other point, I'll try and do a video on Zen ethics. I think for now, maybe I'll just close with something that my mentor told me once when I was questioning my teacher's sexual misconduct. My mentor said, look, and he wasn't saying this to justify my teacher's behavior. He was just trying to help me out in the moment. He said, don't give up on your practice. He said, Zen isn't fundamentally about good and bad. It's about where good and bad come from. And I think this is a really, really important teaching because it's free of our sticky, subjective, human BS. And that's one of the gifts that the tradition gives us. But it doesn't ignore ethics. So there's the koan Hyakujo's Fox where the student asks the Zen master, hey, is this other Zen master bound by cause and effect, or good and bad, let's say? And the Zen master says he can't ignore it. So a Zen master cannot ignore cause and effect, good and bad. Nobody can. This is the koan. You're both not bound by good and bad and bound by good and bad. As long as there's a YouTube channel to post on, I will be unpacking these teachings of Tathagata Zen that my teacher gave me. Please, I love interacting and coming off of comments. So if you have any questions, ideas, critiques, throw them in the comments section below. Hit subscribe and hit like too, if you will. That helps this channel out. Also, I have got a PayPal and a Patreon link in the description below. I've got a lot of essays and some videos up on Patreon. Really helps me out when you support me there as well as on PayPal. I really appreciate it. I offer all this stuff to you for free, but you know, when you help support this channel, it gives me the juice to keep going, as well as the money to buy equipment. I've got this cheap microphone here. I need to buy a new one because whenever I film indoors, it gets very tinny and echoey. God bless. Ciao. Have a great day.